France's finance minister has warned that a trade war with the U.S. could erupt in a few days and has called on 6 of the G7 finance ministers to come up with some decisive action to counter U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminium. But is all this talk of trade war simply just another of President Trump's negotiating tactics? And after Google gives notice to pull out of a Pentagon project, I'll be asking if the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in military weapons is starting to cross moral red lines that are a step too far. Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. France's Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire warned at a G7 finance chiefs meeting that a trade war could begin in a few days. It follows the U.S. being isolated over its imposition of a 25% tax on steel and 10% tax on aluminium from the EU, Mexico and Canada. President Trump tweeted on Saturday that the U.S. had been ripped off by other countries for years on trade, and it's time to get smart. The move immediately triggered vows of retaliation from Mexico, Canada and the EU, which called the tariffs protectionism, pure and simple. As the U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross just left Beijing on Sunday after some progress had been made on how to avert a trade war between the U.S. and China, why did the Trump administration turn around and slap its allies? The French finance minister also urged 6 of the group of 7 finance chiefs to take decisive action at their summit next week in Quebec. Why did the U.S. choose to punish its closest allies while it is still in the early stage of a row with China? What is going on in the bloc? Joining me for the discussion from Edmonton, Canada is Dr. Wenran Jiang, a senior fellow at the Institute of Asian Research in the University of British Columbia, and in the Beijing studio, Professor James Ray, a visiting scholar at the Beijing Foreign Studies University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Dr. Jiang in Edmonton, let me come to you first. Why do you think President Trump is doing this to its allies at this particular moment? We know these proposed tariffs were announced in March, but it has been pushed off a couple of months. And why is he slapping these tariffs now?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of people are quite puzzled by this kind of a move, quite abrupt. It is already having some kind of a trade war on and off with China now going on one against all to all its allies. I think a number of reasons here. One is that Trump is Trump. He's running out of patience. He has short attention span, saying a few months nothing worked out. We have to put these tariffs on. The other reason, I think, secondly, is the hardliners inside the Trump camp is also wanting to say, let's do this, because they wanted to move on to it rather than leaving it. And finally, I think there is this problem with the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement negotiation going nowhere between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And they're saying they have to put the tariffs on in North American context, at least.
For the European allies, Professor Ray here in the Beijing studio, what do you think Trump is after from them?
Well, of course, Boeing is a major job creator in the United States. And as Professor Jiang said, I think the United States, President Trump is an economic nationalist, and he expressed that in his campaign. And most of his advisors that were in favor of free trade have resigned. And so we're left with a team that really believes they can win these kind of trade wars and have really been able to get all players to engage in this kind of battle rather than using the World Trade Organization or international levels. So I think Trump sees European competitors in the airline industry with Airbus as a direct rival to be challenged, and that the U.S. policy should be to leverage American aircraft companies like Boeing in a global competition.
But we're talking about a much bigger thing, right? We're talking about trade. We're talking about steel, aluminium, and actually there is also this national security investigation going on against car imports from everywhere around the world. So from his European counterparts, is he really just looking at the aerospace industry, or Is he trying to level the trade deficit as well as what he's trying to do with China? Professor Ray, again.
Well, I think on the one hand, politically, the American Midwest is the manufacturing hub, and those are where the jobs are lost. Those are his constituents, and he's looking a little bit toward this fall election where the Republican Party is very vulnerable and is likely to lose control of Congress. And then his election 2 years henceforth, he's going to have to replicate those voters and deliver jobs on the ground in the United States. And manufacturing is where America's hollowed out, and these are the kind of jobs that can be physically retained. Of course, you know, the structural impediments are there. American wages are so high, these aren't really jobs that are going to come back in large numbers. So there isn't really a pathway for economic progress in this approach.
Dr. Jiang in Edmonton, you mentioned just now that there is some kind of a multifaceted trade war going on, or potential ones going on with China. You know, the negotiation is not going very well now that he's opening new fronts with the EU, with Mexico, with Canada. Why does President Trump and his administration believe that they can handle all of this at the same time?
Well, I don't think they really care about what they can handle or what they can't handle. They're just going, this thing you can say, with China, people say it's a rivalry relationship with a rising superpower that potentially will challenge the U.S. hegemonic power, and yet now Trump is going after all its allies. This seems to be a trade war intention or a tactic for trade negotiations to, you know, for negotiation tactics that does not have any ideological or strategic lines. They're just going after Canada, which the Canadian Prime Minister here, I mean, Canada last week reacted very strongly, not only calling it protectionist, but is, you know, unacceptable, you know, deplorable. The Europeans call it illegal, you know, unacceptable. It's all over the place. So I don't think Trump at the moment has a lot of strategic thinking going into all this one against all situation.
Well, actually, in a recent opinion piece on Financial Times, it was said that President Trump and his team, they just kind of go and do things without thinking what next. But you can, in reality, his actions are bound to trigger some reactions, maybe a series of reactions. Professor Ray, what's going to happen next if President Trump insists on going ahead with these tariffs and also come to a not so favorable conclusion on on America's trading partner on the car tariffs?
I think this is somewhat favorable to his plan, is because Canada announced retaliatory tariffs. China has said they would apply retaliatory tariffs. The Europeans are threatening the same thing. I think he wants a trade war. He wants a world of economic protectionism and rivalries, and countries are following suit rather than saying we're going to isolate the United States and we're going to follow international rules that have been negotiated since World War II that uphold norms of most favored nation status and non-discrimination to other countries. And we're not going to deal with the United States. We're not going to play this game. But I think by playing the game, that enters into this kind of old-fashioned, you know, pre-World War II type of mercantilist policies, beggar-thy-neighbor policies, that will damage the world economy. But I think, you know, Trump believes the U.S. could you know, sustain and win this kind of battle, at least in the short term.
Well, President Trump probably has his domestic political agenda, right, to win the midterm election. That's what a lot of people are saying. But by doing this, Dr. Jiang, by going after at everybody and, you know, sounding the loudest rhetoric and, you know, waving the sticks, whatever, whether or not he really uses these sticks in the end. But can the U.S. economy afford such disruptive relationship with its trade partners, all of its most important trading partners?
Well, that's a good question. I think Trump here is making a calculation as well as a gamble. The calculation is that if he acts populist, if he acts tough, if you look at his TV images, interviews, it's all about America first. Clearly, this is a political point-scoring situation for the midterm election, which is coming up in the fall. it is also at the same time a gamble. That is to say, by doing this, they would bully its way around either with China, with North America, with the EU countries. Then in return, everybody kind of fear him and come to the negotiation tables, eventually reaching a deal that's more adventurous to Trump. So don't be surprised. All these elements work together by next week. When Trump goes to Quebec for the G7 meetings, the U.S. commentator actually call him a skunk. At the G7, it will be G6 against one situation. He may just leverage this kind of blasting situation and go there and offer something nice as a negotiation tactics.
Professor Ray, do you think eventually this is going to do something good for the American business people? I mean, for instance, we're seeing stock markets rally consistently. We're seeing the highest job employment figures. We're seeing U.S. companies unanimously supporting being tougher on countries such as China to reining the huge deficit and to tackle the so-called forced technology transfer. Do you think Trump is going to get somehow what he wants using the way he does?
No, because I think globally competitive companies, and America is very globally competitive, benefit from free trade, and they're harmed by protectionist policies. 200 years ago, the U.S. Had protectionist policies because America had weak companies. It's not a tactic that's appropriate for very developed countries. Developing countries often need to protect their economy till they're globally competitive. And so I think American U.S. Chamber of Commerce has lobbied against these tariffs. American agriculture has been opposed to a trade war. I think there are large sectors of the business community that will be very terrified of a trade war. And the stock market, which had such a glorious reign last year, is down because of the threats of trade war. And whenever there's a calming, it goes up. So I think it's actually working opposite of what Trump wants, and the markets aren't favoring his rhetoric.
And do you think there's a kind of a man-made hype here? Because after all, if you look at the statistics, the trade between the United States and Canada and Mexico amount for over $1 trillion US, whereas it is reported that the steel and aluminum tax only affect about $4 billion US of import and export between the United States and Mexico. And according to Robert Ross, the United States is willing and eager to negotiate with these partners on these measures. So, Professor Ray, what are the messages being sent here?
Well, I think the hopeful view of Trump's presidency is that these are negotiating tactics, and when the U.S.-China trade team met in Washington, China offered significant concessions to lower the trade deficit, and then inexplicably the U.S. threatened more tariffs after that. I think if it's a tactic with the Europeans and the Canadians to renegotiate NAFTA and have a more favorable trade arrangement and win some small concessions, then maybe there's some progress. But I'm more concerned that this is truly the commitment of the Trump administration, who is very hostile to multilateral institutions, very hostile to free trade, to really break apart the norms that have governed the last 70 years of international political economy.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Wenran Jiang, a senior fellow at the Institute of Asian Research in the University of British Columbia, and Professor James Ray, a visiting scholar at the Beijing Foreign Studies University. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a very short break, and when we come back, I'll be asking if there's a moral line to be drawn in the use of artificial intelligence for military applications. Stay with me. At a meeting with employees last Friday, Google Cloud CEO Diane Greene announced that Google will not seek another contract with the U.S. Department of Defense, or DoD, in Project Maven. The project, also known as the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, was launched in April last year to develop and integrate computer vision algorithms needed to help military and civilian analysis in counterinsurgency operations. A current contract between Google and the Pentagon expires in 2019 and involves controversial work providing AI for analyzing drone footage. The decision came after over 3,000 Google employees signed a petition in protest saying Google should not be in the business of war. The Pentagon has reportedly made AI the centerpiece of its weapons strategy. Funding for the Maven project almost doubled to reach $130 million in the federal budget signed in March by U.S. President Donald Trump. So what's the difference between the use of big data and machine learning in military application from technological advancements in the past? Is Google's decision a short-term reaction to employee protests and adverse publicity, or part of a sweeping strategy among tech companies not to pursue military work? And how much of a setback, if any, would the deal have on Pentagon's AI programs? I'm pleased to be joined by two guests, one from Oxford, in the Oxford University in the UK, Professor Nick Bostrom, who is the director of the program on the impacts of future technology at Oxford Martin School. In Beijing, we have Mr. Li Dawei, CEO and founder of the China Thinkers Bureau. Gentlemen, it's great to have both of you on the show. Dr. Bostrom, let me go to you first. Explain to us, first of all, what is the difference between the application of AI technology and machine learning in military warfare compared to past technological advancements? What is the difference? Why AI is attracting so much controversy here?
I think it's a somewhat fuzzy boundary. To some extent, it's a different research community that is driving the cutting edge with machine learning than was the case with big data. So there are just some differences in culture between these two different research communities. Also, I think with artificial intelligence, there is what we have today, but there is also this immense vision of what AI might become over the coming years and decades. There is this sense that ultimately this will be a very important and transformative technology, more so maybe than with big data. And I think that also encourages people to think harder about the longer-term consequences of the actions they take.
Right. Mr. Li, we all talk about, for instance, IBM interballistic missiles, guided missiles. Basically there, the missile is also kind of autonomous, right? It finds its own target. What is the difference then? When that technology is being used for the first time, were people talking about banning such, not letting weapon having its own smartness?
Okay, thank you, Nick. So first of all, I think no war is good war. No weapons are good weapons. So people have been using advanced technology to improve the quality and the quantity of the weapons for many, many years, for 100 years. But there indeed a distinguished difference between the AI-driven weaponization with the past technology development. So firstly, AI development, some advanced countries like the United States or the OECD countries has larger advancement compared with some developing countries and some ideologically different nations. Secondly, AI would be driven by the capital, the best scientists and the best entrepreneurs. For example, the Silicon Valley would help United States to improve their AI in a degree which is exponentially greater than many other competing nations. So that would make a total difference.
Professor Bostrom, let me come to you again. Let's just look at the logic of the U.S. Defense Department. They're basically trying to use unmanned drones to detect terrorist targets at a lower cost and at a lower risk without invoking great casualty. From this perspective, don't you think AI technology has the potential, has the advantage to improve the efficiency of these strikes without causing as much casualties? Why should they? Is it a right strategy that they're pursuing there?
I mean, I could certainly see why, if you are a big military, you would want to invest in AI. And I think there are many applications, not just to lethal autonomous weapons, but in the background, if you have a big military logistics center, let us say, then for the same reasons that Amazon wants AI to predict demand curves. So could you benefit from that if you're a big military organization? Nevertheless, I think there is a strong sense among many of the leading machine learning researchers that they don't really want to be a part of that, of the militarization of AI. And ultimately, some other company or some other maybe second-tier or third-tier researchers will step in and fill that void. But what it does mean is that the leading edge of artificial intelligence might be developed in the civilian sector rather than in the military sector. And that might be positive as we think about these scenarios of how AI might transform the world in the future.
Well, you have been very strong about the fact or the hypothesis that by developing AI, we human beings are basically digging our own graves. The biggest enemy of ourselves is the superintelligence that we're building. So do you think that in applying AI to weapons, to unmanned drones, we're moving further on that path?
Well, I mean, I would say that I also think there's this enormous upside of machine intelligence, provided we do it right and are careful and work out, scalable control methods, etc. I think the potential is there for a hugely beneficial impact as well. I think, though, that there are two separate concerns, really, with very advanced AI. So one is how we could ensure that the AI itself is aligned with human values and intentions. So that's ultimately a technical problem that research is now going on. But then there's a second problem, which is to make sure that we humans, if we can control the AI, then don't misuse it, that we don't use it to wage war or cause destruction or oppress people. And that ultimately is a political problem rather than a technical problem. And I think on the margin, seeing AI being applied more for military purposes is kind of makes a solution to that political problem maybe slightly less probable. But I don't think it necessarily increases the risk of the first problem, that we would lose control of the AI.
Mr. Lee, what is your take on the kind of danger of further application of AI in weaponry?
My point of view is a human being has been developing one technology after another technology. Very good metaphor is like 60 years ago, we have the first weaponized nuclear weapons at the end of the Second World War. During that time, if you research the media and the newspapers, people is afraid of the Armageddon is coming, the end of human society is coming. But in fact, after 60 or 70 years of progress, although we have many nuclear bombs all across the world, but human society benefits much hugely from the nuclear powers, and the benefit is brought to us. We have best clean energy. We have a shipcraft could ship forever using the nuclear reactors. And only yesterday, we have a better deal from the South Korea leaders and President Trump declaring the ending of the war in Korea. So we have better grasp and control of the nuclear power. So we do not have to be so negative. We should be more optimistic to AI and other emerging new technologies.
Professor Bostrom, do you agree with what Mr. Lee's opinions here?
Well, I think with regard to nuclear weapons, there is an element of luck. If you look at the historical research that is coming out now that some of these archives of classified materials are being opened up from the Cold War, it's striking how close the world seems to have come on several occasions to a nuclear conflagration between the US and the Soviet Union. There were some really close calls. So I don't think we should draw too strong a lessons from the fact that we managed to survive this dangerous period. In any case, I do think the world should embrace AI and that it has this enormous potential for benefiting society. But as with any powerful technology, there is also the risk of misuse. And the more we can discourage that, I think the brighter the prospects.
What kind of impact will the improved or greater use of AI technologies in weaponry have on international politics, Mr. Lee?
So if any nation or nations have the advancement of AI technology would become a term I mentioned called AI hegemony. So meaning one nation has the AI, all the AI weaponization, best weapons. So all the traditional global political orders will be broken. All the trade policies and the current world orders will be changed. So that won't be the best scenario of our future. So if that happens, in the end, so what's the best food in the world? Probably McDonald's, because that country, that president would have the best weapon, AI weapons.
Early April, in Geneva, representatives of 120 UN member countries had this discussion of a potential ban on lethal AI-infused weaponry. Professor Bostrom, what do you think of the timing of such a ban? Do you think the timing is right to have such a ban yet?
Well, if it is going to be banned, I think now would be the right time, because once it's more widely deployed, it's going to be harder to roll it back. I can see arguments on both sides. On the one hand, it does seem desirable to prevent another arms race and the rush to weaponize AI technology. If the world can refrain from doing that, that seems preferable. On the other hand, I think it's quite hard to draw the boundary around exactly what is the thing you want to forbid. Mm-hmm. If you say any decision to take a life should be made by a human, well, if what that amounts to in practice is that there is somebody sitting in a big office building in Virginia, some 19-year-old whose job it is, whenever a box appears on the screen, fire now, they have to press a red button. If that's what it means to have a human in the loop, it's not clear how much more accountability that introduces than having the robot make the decision itself. Also, if it can increase the precision with which military strikes are conducted, maybe it could reduce collateral damage. And if there are going to be wars, better there are no wars, but if there are going to be wars, perhaps you prefer their wars be robots killing robots rather than humans killing humans. So I think it would be better if we could find some way to prevent this kind of arms race with a treaty. But I haven't actively involved myself with that particular campaign for these reasons that I mentioned.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Professor Nick Bostrom, who is the director of the program on the impacts of future technology at Oxford Martin School, and Li Dawei, CEO and founder of the China Thinkers Bureau. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.